Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk.Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is James Cridland, founder of Podnews. It's the podcast industry's daily news briefing in the form of a daily newsletter and podcast. The newsletter now has over 33,000 subscribers and is perhaps the most respected and well-known source of news in the podcast industry. James, welcome to the show.
Perhaps. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so I want to start with sort of the history of Podnews a little bit. We're now coming up on, I think, the 9-year anniversary. That's a long time to be running a daily newsletter. Tell me sort of the origins of Podnews and, what was your goal when you first started it?
Yeah, well, so I've worked in audio and radio ever since 1989. So a long time. And I was speaking at a radio conference. I think it was the Worldwide Radio Summit in Los Angeles. I may have been the worldwide bit. Who knows? But anyway, I was talking at a radio conference, and a friend of mine in the bar afterwards said, "James, where do you find your news about podcasting?" And I thought, oh, that's interesting. There really isn't anywhere. There was Nick Quah that was writing a weekly newsletter at the time, but that was about it. And Nick was focusing on a particular area of the podcast industry, but not all of podcasting. So I thought, well, maybe that's something that I can do. And so it basically started from that. Within a month, I'd got something up and running. And I've been doing it ever since, every single weekday. Not had a day off in 8 years.
It's incredible.
So so this is why I'm looking as if I'm going slightly mad.
Yeah, I know a bit of that pain. Of course, my newsletter is not daily, it's weekly. And even that, I've been doing it for about 6 years now. But I know the sort of pressure of, keeping that consistency.
Yeah.
What have you sort of done over the years with the newsletter to kind of differentiate it from some of your competitors and sort of from other media that covers the podcast industry as well?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of sort of things that I have done. I mean, I think, firstly, the reason why the newsletter looks the way it does and comes out at the time when it does is purely in terms of workflow. So I built the entire thing so that I could theoretically do it in an hour and a half after I'd done a day job. That was my goal. So everything, the reason why it's small bullet points rather than massive long articles, the reason why, it looks the way it does, the reason why it comes out at 9 o'clock in the evening, my time, I'm in Australia, which is 7 in the morning at the moment, Eastern time, it is purely because of that. It's being as straightforward in terms of workflow as I possibly could. So quite a lot of it comes from that, but also that was a big difference and a big differentiator between the type of thing that Podnews is, which is it's an overview of everything happening in the podcast industry, but the global podcast industry, very different, I think, to some of the things that were going on at the time, very US focused, very focused around, the sort of the NPR type of podcast rather than anything else.
Yeah.
And I think, as you can tell from my ridiculous English accent, but also the fact that I live here in Australia, I've worked for companies in Canada, the US, as well as across Europe. Quite a lot of that is I think a real help because I've got a different view into the industry than perhaps other journalists do in this field.
Yeah, as you mentioned, you've spent decades in audio. You worked at Virgin Radio and the BBC, and now you're doing Podnews. I'm curious how that background sort of shaped the way you approach journalism in this industry, and how you have sort of shaped the newsletter around that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in that a long time ago, I used to be a radio presenter, so I was on the air, and I got lots of legal training back in those days, which has been very helpful for this part of my life. Knowing what I can and can't say. Looking forward to some questions about Inception Point AI later.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, I'm good from a journalistic background in terms of that sort of training, and that's been really helpful to me. But also really helpful has been, being able to work for small companies, which Virgin Radio was, and very large companies, which the BBC was, and be able to understand a little bit about how those types of companies operate. And I think, that's something a lot of journalists, I think, are very, they've been doing journalism all of their life. They come out of university having done journalism. They go in and they work within newsrooms and things. And I think, running a business, being involved in a business, is a really useful thing to help inform some of the things that you write about in the industry. So I think that that's been really helpful for me.
That's interesting. Did you go to school for journalism?
I didn't. No.
Oh,
I went to school.
okay.
I knew that I wanted to work in radio. So the things that I learnt when I was at school were music, politics, and physics. There's a mix.
That's quite the smorgasbord.
Yeah, exactly. So physics for the electronic side of radio, music for the music side of radio, and politics for the kind of journalism side. But because I knew that I wanted to get into radio or audio, but I didn't quite know what. So I figured that if I learned everything about that part of the industry, then that would probably be a good plan. So yeah.
Very interesting. I'm curious, when you're sort of deciding what goes in the newsletter every day, do you have kind of an internal test or threshold that you set for, what stories deserve to be included? Obviously, you can't include everything. There's a lot of things that happen. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, the basic test is, do I find this interesting?
Okay.
That's the number one test, which is a bad thing. I mean, anybody would tell you that you shouldn't be writing this for yourself. You should be writing this for other people. But actually, I think seeing whether something is interesting is a good plan. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I've got metrics in terms of what stories people click on, which occasionally I will go and have a look at. And pretty well always, the story that I think is the most interesting is never the story which gets clicked on the most. Which I always find fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But so that's so the threshold there is what I find interesting. What people would expect to be in the newsletter, but also things like, if it's going to be the lead story, do I have a good image that goes around that? There are plenty of stories that have become the number one story because I've got a great picture. And if I don't have a great picture, it's harder to make it the number one story. It still might justify being the number one story, but it's harder to do that. So it's certainly a help if you're going to pitch me a story. Certainly a help if there's a nice image that goes alongside that, because that's one less job that I have to do.
That's a good tip for anybody that wants to pitch you.
Yeah.
I certainly resonate also with the comment you just made about, it's never the story you think that's going to resonate the most. And for me, it's rarely the podcast that I recommend that I think is going to do, that'll be most popular with my subscribers. And you're just, I get surprised a lot. Both you and Podnews have received a lot of awards, which is amazing. And you were recently included into the Podcast Hall of Fame. Congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious how you view these milestones in the way they sort of affect and have an impact on Podnews.
Yeah, I think awards are interesting, and I write about awards, and sometimes I write very positive things about awards, and sometimes I'm pointing out that some of these awards are just a little bit strange. But I think, the awards that I've won are mine. They're not actually for the Podnews newsletter. I would like to win some awards for the newsletter because I think I do a good job there. But, obviously, what I've been awarded for includes what I do in terms of the newsletter as well. At the end of the day, look, everybody likes being told that they have done a great job. And I think one of the things around podcasting particularly is that it's quite a lonely business. Podcasting, you are doing stuff, you're working by yourself quite a lot of the time. You are in a small room, you are talking into a microphone, and any feedback that you get is magnified, ridiculously in comparison to any normal job. If you're a wait staff in a cafe, for example,
Yeah.
you will get an awful lot of different reactions to the work that you do in comparison to somebody whose job is to sit in a room, all day and not talk to other people. So I think that's a particular thing for podcasting, and why things like comments on podcasts, ratings and reviews, all of that kind of stuff. You hear a lot of people asking for those because, frankly, it's the only feedback that we get.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's quite useful to have that feedback, I think.
And I think that's part of the reason why I find podcasters to be fascinating as sort of a group of people as well, because you're right, they do work in isolation a lot of the time. They are sort of semi-dependent on, the generosity of feedback that they get from total strangers.
Yeah.
And
or not particularly generous.
Or not. Exactly.
Which is the other thing.
Yeah, they have to be able to endure a lot of, hate and in many cases, not so great feedback. But they also have to be very multifaceted. They have to learn how to promote their shows. They have to be marketers. They have to be able to produce a show. They have to wear a lot of hats.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And it's that sort of multi-platform stuff. Somebody who I was talking to recently introduced themselves to me as a multi-hyphenate. And I thought to myself, I've been a multi-hyphenate for the last 30 years, young man. so
I hear you.
Yeah.
Now, the podcast industry's grown a lot, obviously, but, there's still only so many people in the podcasting industry. So I'm sort of wondering what growth looks like for you and the newsletter. Who do you view as your main audiences, and sort of how do you plan to reach more of them?
Yeah, I think that is a fascinating question that I grapple with quite a lot of the time, because there's two sides of that. The first side is what is the ceiling for the serious podcaster that wants to read the Podnews newsletter. And I also publish the Podcast Business Journal, which is a weekly newsletter very specifically for the business of podcasting. So what is the ceiling there? How many people realistically can I reach? And Podnews at the moment is around 34,000 people, and 34,000 people getting that newsletter every single day. That is a number that hasn't changed too much in the last 18 months. Does that tell me that I'm pretty well at saturation point, or does that tell me that I'm just not very good at getting the message out? I don't know. But, so I think that there's sort of one side of that. The second side of that is, what would it mean if I doubled the audience? Could I charge double for the advertising? No.
Right.
Would it cost me twice as much in terms of running the mailing list? Yes. So what would it actually mean? So I think that there's a question there in terms of what that means. And I also think, and I don't want to sound complacent at all on this, but I also think growing all the time, always looking for growth, isn't necessarily something that is actually particularly healthy in terms of society in general, or the way that we operate as businesses. At the end of the day, if we are the right size, and I think that Podnews right now is the right size, if we're the right size, then is that something that we should be celebrating, not going, but how can we get bigger?
Sure.
And so I've kind of got a bit of a belief that the only thing that Podnews frankly isn't the right size for is I can't hire anyone else.
I understand.
So and so that essentially means that when I want to stop doing this, what happens then? So what I really need to be thinking about at the moment is, how can I grow to a degree that I can hire my successor, train that successor up, and then leave a healthy business in the hands of someone else. That's probably a conversation that, at some point I'm going to have, but it's not a conversation necessarily that I need to have right now. So so growth, not always a thing that we should be too concerned about, I think.
I hear you. And I must admit that I do have some of those same thoughts as well. There's no question, grappling with the idea of, what do I need to do to grow it? Am I comfortable with where it's at?
Yeah.
And like you said at the beginning there, what is the actual ceiling? One thing that I've noticed, I've been a subscriber to your newsletter for a long time. And obviously you've been able to get, a fairly wide base of sponsors for your newsletter, which is amazing. Large companies, mid-sized companies, smaller companies, you report on a lot of these companies as well. Curious how you think about that tension, right? Between, in part, being financially supported by some of these companies, by way of sponsorship, and reporting on them, ethically as a journalist. I'm just fascinated by that tension.
It's a incredible tightrope. Yes, I think about this a lot, actually. So I think a few things. So firstly, the way that Podnews works is that we've essentially got three separate things that we earn money from. We've got the display advertising, the title sponsor, for example, that sort of thing. We've got supporters who appear at the bottom of the newsletter, who are both personal and from companies, who pay an amount per month, really to support us. They don't get anything special from us. They are there because they are essentially bankrolling the entire operation. And then there's some classified advertising in there as well, which is automated advertising that anybody can just jump in with a credit card and away you go.
Yeah.
And I deliberately looked at, okay, how can I widen the amount of revenue that we get from the industry as much as possible so that I'm not reliant on one or two big companies? Because then it gets really hard. If you're going to write something mean about a company, it then gets really hard to do that in an ethical way. And so I've been very lucky to be able to have a business there which has very diversified revenue in terms of lots of different companies. And I have a head of sales who speaks to advertisers. I don't speak to advertisers. That's not me. So I'll obviously help them with things. But in terms of convincing them that the advertising is a good thing, then that's not what I do. And indeed, quite often I will be pushing back against some things that advertisers want to end up doing. So that's kind of, one thing. I have had people who have stopped supporting me as a direct result of me reporting on their companies.
Wow.
I should point out it makes for a good story if you do that. So just bear that in mind. But I've also had people, I won't mention who the company is because they've changed and they're good now. But I was writing something about a particular company and doing it on a fairly regular basis. And they came up to me at an event and they said, James, how can we stop you from writing this stuff about this thing that we are doing?
Right.
And I said, just stop doing it. Just stop doing it because it's not good for the industry. It's not good for the industry. It's not a good thing.
That's the right answer.
And they went, okay, is there anything else that we can do? And I said, no, just stop doing it. And they went, hold on a minute. They turned around. They went to speak to my head of sales.
Wow.
10 minutes later, they came back to me and they said, we're now sponsoring the such and such section. And we hope that will help you in your editorial choices.
Incredible.
And then turned around and walked away. So the very next day, I wrote another piece that was very, very, very aggressive against this company, directly on top of their advertising sponsorship. directly on top of it. And I got a lot of people who realized what I was doing and said, good on you. So companies have tried to use that as a way of getting positive comment as well. And I tend to rail against that because I'm lucky enough that actually I don't care.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if you go away, because I've shown that you're doing something bad. If you're doing something bad, that's something that I kind of have to cover. So so that's
an incredible story. James, you're my new hero, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. But I can only do that because I have so many people who are corporate supporters, who are personal supporters. I've got over 100 personal supporters.
Wow.
And I can only do it because of the generosity of those people. And I never say thank you enough to them. So that's just worthwhile bearing in mind as well.
For sure. I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk about kind of the current state of the podcasting industry, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
YouTube, obviously a big topic nowadays. Yes. From what I understand, they're sort of the number one weekly podcast platform, at least in the US now, ahead of Spotify and Apple. And I came across a quote of yours from 2024, I think it was.
Oh dear, here we
go. Where you said that if YouTube becomes dominant, most people in the podcasting will be out of a job. Given YouTube's growth and where we are now in 2026, do you think that prediction is coming true?
Thankfully, I don't think that YouTube is as dominant as some of the stories are.
Okay.
For a start. I think that there is a conversation around podcast apps that people use. If they are asked about YouTube, they will say, well, yes, of course I use YouTube because everybody uses YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And while Edison Research's Infinite Dial proves me wrong on this, my suggestion is that yes, number one, in terms of people using it, YouTube is definitely there. Number one, in terms of actual consumption of podcasts, I'm still not sure that YouTube is number one. So
where does your skepticism come from about that?
I think it's just purely you can understand that people would say, of course, I use YouTube every single week. I use YouTube every single day. So of course I'm going to say that that's high, and of course I will have watched a podcast on there because podcast clips get surfaced all the time. But when I'm listening to podcasts, then I personally use Apple Podcasts. But that's the app that I use. And I think they are different. And I think if you ask the question, what podcast app do you use, and you give them tick boxes that includes YouTube, you will get different answers to where do you consume the majority of your podcasts. So I think that that's sort of one sort of side of that. But the point that I was making is that the whole podcast ecosystem is built from podcast hosting companies who are there to host your show. You don't need those with YouTube. It's built from podcast ad sales companies who are selling advertising for you. And again, you don't need that in terms of YouTube. They come from, this whole variety of different bits of the podcast industry, which if YouTube is the only place for you to consume podcasts, we don't need anymore. And so the likes of Buzzsprout and Captivate and Libsyn can all close down because there's no need for any of them. And I think that is still holds up. I think that that's one of the benefits of YouTube still being, even if it's number one, it's 40% of the industry. It's not 90% of the industry. And Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all of the other podcast apps still out there is the reason why this industry is still so vibrant and so exciting, because it's open and because there's lots of different places to consume stuff like that.
Pulling on that thread a little bit more, video obviously is a big topic as well in general in podcasting now. And as I've been talking to more podcasters, one thing that has been coming up over and over again is this sort of tension and competing interests that podcasters have, in the sense that they're now they actively understand that one of the major driving discoverability mechanisms is video. A lot of these short form platforms, right? TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. It's sort of we're living in the clip age as far as the internet goes. But of course, that comes with a price, right? That increases production price for, independent podcasters, bigger podcasters. It's more effort, it's more time, it's more editing, and it's, the tools that they are given, tools like even Riverside, what we're using to record this podcast. Yeah, they have some built-in AI that they use to develop clips. They're okay, but they're not great. And so again, that leads to sort of more cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about that sort of tension between podcasters wanting to use these platforms to be discovered, but they don't necessarily want to pay the price in terms of production time?
Yeah, I think it's really, I think what worries me about the rise of video is that people think that they have to do it.
Yeah.
People think that video is a must, not a would be nice. And that is actually stopping people from getting involved in podcasting in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because instead of the conversation about what microphone do I need and how am I going to edit this audio, the conversation is now, how many ring lights do I need and which camera angles should I be thinking about and how do I build my studio and all of those conversations that should probably come later. My argument would be. So I think I do worry that we have unnecessarily, in many cases, complicated the way that podcasting, is these days.
Yeah.
Video is absolutely great. There are certain shows that will work fantastically on video. There are certain shows such as this one where you are talking to somebody where actually, you can relatively easily make video with the tools that people will offer you.
Mm-hmm.
You can't necessarily make a video podcast as easily as something like Serial. Well, you can, but it costs over $1 million and it's called a documentary.
Right.
So there are certain shows that work and certain shows that don't. And the other sort of side of it is what it does to the audio product. If you start, I was listening to The Rest is Politics, which is a very popular UK podcast, which is also available in video. And there was an episode, and it really stuck with me a couple of months ago. It was an episode that started, well, as you can see, we're not in our usual UK homes today. And this was a video this was a video clearly, but I was just listening to this as a podcast.
Yeah. As
you can see, we're in Romania. How would I see that?
Yeah.
How I'm coming from a radio background, the way that with respect to the good folk at Goalhanger who are significantly more successful than I am, I would have started that by saying, well, as you can see, we're in a beautiful, ornate room at the moment. It's mostly marble. It's there's a grand piano in the background. Rory, this isn't your usual study, is it? Just something just to explain what the viewers could hear. And it worries me that we are going to a point where audio is second best. And that's something that I really don't believe in. Audio is different. Audio is a different consumption medium. Audio is something for your ears when your eyes are busy.
That's right.
And I don't think that we should be treating audio as a second best medium. So that's the thing that I get a little bit upset about,
Fair
to
enough.
be honest. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about AI a little bit. We briefly sort of mentioned that at the top. Inception Point AI. They're still producing, I think, like 3,000 AI-generated podcast episodes per week. And obviously their costs are quite low and they're able to profit because of, programmatic advertising. I've seen the CEO of that company call critics sort of lazy Luddites.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you feel about that. And also, what do you think is the obligation of some of these major platforms like Apple and Spotify to disclose or remove these AI-generated podcasts?
So I would rather put this to the publishers and the podcast hosts that enable them. I don't think it's Spotify and Apple's role to police this space.
Okay.
I do think it's the publisher's role to produce ethical content, and the podcast hosting companies that are enabling them, I think that they have a big part to play. There should be a very clear signpost that something is AI generated, wholly AI generated. But I think it's a publishers and a podcast hosts issue more than necessarily what Spotify and Apple should be doing. But, Inception Point AI isn't just releasing lots of episodes. Mm-hmm. They're releasing lots of new shows. Yesterday, they released 261 new shows.
That is insane.
261, it is, every single day, including weekends. 261 new shows that get in the way of audiences finding podcasts from humans.
Yeah.
And some of those 261 shows are advice on things like gambling addiction or abusive relationships, produced by an AI voice that calls itself a doctor, and some of which hasn't even been heard by a human, let alone checked before it was published. And the fact that it's entirely generated by AI isn't clear, deliberately not clear in my opinion, until you begin listening to it. And by then, they're quid in because they've got their money from their download.
Yeah.
The CEO, I think, is very good at the sharp responses that get her press. Mm-hmm. I think she said the other day that people who call it AI slop are still making 6-7 jokes. Very cute, very nice, and it's a good response. But I don't think that she's as good as at behaving ethically, I would argue. And what I find really depressing is that her previous job was at Spotify, which was an incredibly powerful, creative podcast creator. And now, in my opinion, all she's doing is filling podcast directories with cheap shit that debases everything that the industry stands for. And I think that companies like that, and frankly, like iHeart Spreaker, who are enabling this behavior, selling the ads on those shows, I think that they do need to be called out because I don't think it's good for any of us.
How could it be? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You're right. It's a tidal wave of crap that, you're right. People want to hear human voices. People develop these parasocial relationships where they grow to trust their podcasters that they're listening to all the time. And now you have an insertion of wholly synthetic content. Like you said, it's not being checked. It's not being verified. Yeah, I have a hard time understanding that business model.
Yeah, I was listening to one of the shows. I totally understand the business model, by the way. But I was listening to one of the shows that they had put out, and it was a biography of a author in Portuguese, and they had put this out. The audio, by the way, didn't say that it was produced by AI at all, but you could very easily tell, even if you don't speak Portuguese. But in the middle of this show that Inception Point had released and placed on Apple and on Spotify and on other platforms, in the middle of this show, all of a sudden, the AI voice stopped talking in Portuguese and started talking in English and said, "I'm a bit confused about the prompt that you have given me. Do you mean this author or do you mean this author?
Right.
I will assume that you mean this author and continue." And that was in the middle of a show that had gone out. Another one of my favorites was a show that they produced, which was the history of Sydney. And I'm in Australia, and so the history of Sydney, okay. And they started talking about the first fleet when people were going out there, who of course weren't the first to visit Sydney at all. And they were talking about, Captain Cook and all of those sorts of things. And then they started talking about her jeans ad and why her jeans ad was really not a particularly good and well thought out PR thing. And I was thinking, sorry, I'm listening to the history of Sydney. Oh, the history of Sydney Sweeney. Oh, that's what's happened. and you just think, really? But unfortunately, I think it just debases what we do as podcasters. And I just find it wholly depressing that we are allowing the industry to be full of this sort of stuff, because it's just not great for anyone.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot. I have a background in marketing, been working in marketing for a long time. But it reminds me of sort of what happened when a lot of these AI tools first became available, especially in the SEO world, where marketers basically saw it as license to mass produce content, written content. And it's only gotten worse. I saw a statistic not too long ago that said that now the majority of content that is released every day is written by AI. And it is leading to, poorer and poorer outcomes for publishers across the board. So, they've in some ways done it to themselves. And I think, it's very analogous to what you describe in the podcasting world as well right now.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that AI has a part to play in podcasting. And I think that AI can absolutely help you with things like show me three clips from this show that might be good to promote me, or produce a transcript, for example, or produce show notes that explain what we talked about. I think that absolutely AI has a part to play in that. The Luddites weren't against technology. The Luddites were concerned that the use of technology would make the product worse, and that would put people out of business. You can argue that the Luddites actually had a point, and that's a point that we should probably be a little bit prouder of, I think.
I agree. I'm curious how you feel about podcast discoverability, because when I started my newsletter, I guess a little over 6 years ago now, I had a strong feeling that there was kind of a gap in the market. I felt like the platforms were doing kind of a very poor job of surfacing podcasts that kind of went beyond, the top charts, the top 200 podcasts in any given category. And I think I was right. That gap definitely existed. Now, I do think they've gotten a little bit better at that, but I'm curious how you feel about that, now.
I think that podcast discoverability is fascinating. And, the sort of thing that you do is super useful in helping people find new shows to go and have a listen to. Apple has a very large editorial team across the world. I think they do a really good job of highlighting new shows that people should go and have a listen to as well. I think that they've done a very good job there in terms of that. I don't think that there are enough podcast platforms that are doing something similar. Spotify have a very heavily algorithmically driven thing. They have editorial people too, but it's very heavily algorithmically driven, and that doesn't necessarily surface as much stuff in there. So I think that discoverability is useful there. I think the podcasting itself probably could do more, because I think that there's two things. Firstly, please don't advertise podcasts on other podcasts, because you're just reaching people who are listening to podcasts. Advertise, in the real world. I have a section which I do every so often, which is called "Podcasting in the Real World."
I know it well.
And it's photographs of advertising that you might see for a podcast in a bar or something like that. That to me is much more useful and much more interesting, particularly if you're doing a podcast about, I don't know, coffee culture, and you're going to then market it in coffee places. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? So I think that we could probably be doing that. The thing that does, if you use Pocket Casts, for example, what Pocket Casts has in there is it has a feature in there which is, I think it's called something like "You Might Like." Mm-hmm. And when you click on it, sometimes you can see recommendations from the person who has produced that podcast. It's a feature called Podroll, which a few other podcast apps also support. And places like Buzzsprout, also support too. And so that's a way for you as a podcaster to recommend other shows that you think your audience will like. which to me beats anything that an algorithm can do. And I think that that sort of data is really useful in in helping surface other shows when you've got humans recommending other shows. So I would hope that we see a bit more of that, and that open standard being used by more apps. I mean, Pocket Cast is a great app and a very successful app, but to continue seeing that used by other people would be really helpful, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, this podcast, obviously, it's very small still. I'm still just getting going, but my audience is obviously other podcasters as well. And one of the things I always ask them, but I'll ask you as well, is, if you had to launch a brand new show now, you've seen many, many podcasts during your career, but had no pre-existing audience to leverage, what would your strategy look like for getting the word out?
I mean, I think my strategy, and I don't make podcasts for a living. I mean, I do make podcasts, but I don't make them for a living. I think my strategy would be to be where your audience is, and to, so if you are writing a podcast about underwater knitting, then go to the subreddit for underwater knitting. You know that there will be one. Go there and not spam your podcast, because nobody wants that, but go there and be a good member of the community and be helpful. Firstly, you will get lots of ideas for shows to do about underwater knitting, but secondly, you will start to be recognized as the person that does that podcast about underwater knitting.
Yeah.
So that to me is the thing, and I think again that we that we get overexcited about total download numbers and stuff like that. At the end of the day, to me, it's all about self-sustaining creativity. Can you do something which is which gives you creative joy when you're making something, and that pays its way? And paying its way might be covering the car payment, or it might be being able to take your wife out for a nice meal every month, or it might be more than that. But self-sustaining creativity, to me, is the goal for quite a lot of podcasters. And I think what we've done is we've probably looked at Joe Rogan earning $200 million from his podcast and gone, I want to earn $200 million. Well, actually, for the majority of people out there, I just want to earn, the $200 that I'm paying on the car every month, or the $400, or whatever it might be. And that's a great start. That's a great start.
No doubt.
So, So I think, certainly, think of it that way. The Podnews Weekly Review, for example, which is a show that I do every week. It's 1.5 hours long. If you want to hear more of this accent, that show, it's not got a massive audience, but the audience that it's got is very tightly targeted in terms of people who are involved in podcasting. And that is why we have had people coming to us and saying, we want to sponsor that particular show. Because of the tight target, not because of the large number of people who are downloading that particular show. So again, I think it's not necessarily a case of making everything as big and massive as you possibly can. I think it's really super serving your audience, and good things will happen from that.
Yeah, find your audience, find out where they hang out, and be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I want to switch gears again and just get some of your ideas about how you feel podcasting and podcast influenced, our modern discourse. Going back to the election, Trump appeared on, 14 major podcasts during the 2024 campaign. He went on Rogan, Logan Paul, Theo Von, Lex Friedman. That alone, 70 million YouTube views, I think, as far as the reach goes.
Yeah.
And of course, Kamala Harris turned down Rogan, I think it was 2 weeks before the election. Do you think, in part, podcasters made Trump president again, or is that narrative kind of overblown?
I've never heard of this Trump person who you keep on talking about. It's not made it down here in the news.
You're lucky. You're lucky that you've never heard of this person.
Look, I think there's plenty of reasons why politics around the world is doing what it's doing. A lot of it, I think, is connected to rising inequality and bad education, to be frank. I don't think that podcasts have had as much of an influence as we would probably like them to have. Of course, there will be bits of the podcast industry that are very keen in saying, look, podcasting can really influence people, and so therefore you should be advertising your brand. And I totally understand why they would be saying that. But I'm pretty sure that if you were a Trump supporter or a Harris supporter or a Ron Paul supporter, then you will still be supporting that person irrespective of what somebody said on a podcast.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I get your point. I wonder, though, how we can square that with the fact, and I don't know what it's like in Australia. I'm in Canada, but I do get to see, obviously, I keep my eye on the U.S. rankings, what shows are in the top 10, 20, and there's a very consistent right-wing presence in the top ranks for many, many different categories, but, overall as well. And that hasn't changed much, I'd say over the last 5 years. We're starting to see some, left-wing podcasts rise as well, I guess, in reaction to what we're seeing. But it is still very heavily dominated by right-wing podcasters with massive audiences.
Yeah.
And
I think you're right there, but I would point to radio. Radio has never had successful left-wing. I mean, the pointlessness of debating all of this back to left or right, blue versus red, is in my view moronic. But anyway, let's ignore that bit. Radio has never had very successful left-wing stations. There was one that was tried but failed relatively quickly.
That was the one with Al Franken, right?
Yeah, that's right. Air America. Yeah, and
that's right.
And I think the reason the reason for that, and this may well show you vaguely where my politics are, if you've not already guessed. But I think that the reason for that is that it's really easy to do right-wing commentary, because right-wing commentary is based on punching down and based on hate and based on saying those people over there aren't very good because X, Y, and Z. Whereas left-wing politics, by and large, on a really broad brush, left-wing politics is much more, how can we all get along? How can we all work together? How can we all do this better?
Well, it's not sensational either.
Right? And so therefore it makes life much harder to do, oh my goodness, I can't believe he said that in a podcast or on a radio station. So I think, unfortunately, we are always going to get that. If we're chasing the clicks, if we're chasing sensationalism, then it's much easier to do in terms of right-wing stuff than it is in terms of left-wing stuff on a very basic model. Now, I think that there's a lot to be said for taking politics away from just right versus left. And it's been the interesting thing, here in Australia, where firstly, we have to vote by law. Mm-hmm. If we don't vote, then we get fined. So that's a good start. But also, secondly, instead of just voting for one or other person, we end up voting for everyone, because we have to vote in terms of a voting platform. I'm desperately trying to remember the phrase, but it's
a ranked choice.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, we can actually, instead of playing games like I used to do when I lived in the UK, of going, well, I'm not sure I want Labour in. So therefore, I'm going to probably vote Conservative, even though I don't really want to vote Conservative. I'd much rather be voting Lib Dem. We don't have any of that, any of those games. So you can actually vote for who you really want, and that is quite refreshing in many ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that who you really want is going to get in, but it's actually quite refreshing. So having the preferential voting, there you go, I remembered. That we have in this country has, I think, been really helpful. And I think that has then meant far less of the, I mean, we've still got dreadful media here, but far less of the left versus right, and far more of the a bit more nuanced conversations around what sort of policies we really want, rather than rather than the orange man versus the woman. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't know what it's like all around the world. Obviously, there's repressive regimes in many places around the world, but it seems to me that in the Western world, podcasts in general have been largely left sort of unregulated. And you can see that as a good thing or a bad thing. But do you think more regulation is coming to podcasts? Is it only a matter of time, especially in a place like the US?
Look, I think podcasts are already regulated, and they're already quite well regulated. There are libel laws around what you can and can't say about people. There are advertising laws, what you can and can't say about products. There's all kinds of other rules and regulations that we have to follow, and copyright and everything else. So I think from that point of view, we've already got a lot of these regulations, and I think that is all stuff that we don't necessarily need to change. I think there's a difference in terms of freedom of speech, and I know that the US particularly has a what I've dimly realized in my life is a different definition of freedom than the definition that Europeans have.
Mm-hmm.
So freedom in America is very much around the freedom to do what I like, freedom of nobody else to stop me from doing what I want to do. And freedom in Europe, for very good historical reasons, is freedom from other people that might do me harm.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two very different definitions of the word freedom. And it's only recently that I've realized what is going on. So freedom of speech looks very different if you view it through those different lenses, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm absolutely up for the European version of freedom of speech. Absolutely. The American freedom of speech, is a little bit harder for me as a European. But I think certainly in terms of regulation, in terms of what we can and can't say, I think we're in a pretty good space already, to be honest, in terms of the regulation that we already have.
Yeah, I'm glad that as Canadians, we tend to hew much closer to the European view of what that means. I'm curious, when future media historians look back on this era, what do you think they'll say about podcasting and how it sort of affected the way humans argue, persuade, sell, try to understand one another? Do you think they'll look back and see a tangible impact?
I think it's certainly. I think what's been nice about podcasting has been that it has changed the. It's changed the art of the interview. It's changed that people, instead of trying to talk in 20-second sound bites that will reach the news, they will actually be able to cogently talk for an hour and a half. And I think that is a very useful, helpful thing. And I think you can get to know somebody much more once you've heard them, talking about. Now, it probably makes them sound more reasonable, so we should probably bear that in mind. Oh, he's not. That horrible racist isn't actually so bad after all. So we should possibly be careful there. But I think it's been certainly useful in terms of a reverse away from the sound bites that we had in the 80s. And I think that that's probably been very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what future media historians might also be saying is why is there clearly a very early and bad AI voice pretending that they're a medical doctor? I think that's definitely a question that they'll be asking. But no, I mean, I think we're in a pretty good place. And I think what is so exciting about podcasting is anyone can do it. And I can get a podcast on the same platform that Joe Rogan is on, the same platform that the Midas Touch is on, the same platform that so many other shows are on. And that isn't something that exists anywhere else. You can't just all of a sudden produce a newspaper. You can't all of a sudden launch a TV network. You can't even get onto the TV in most cases because it's very hard. With podcasting, anyone can do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the exciting thing about where we are going. So the democratization of the media, for podcasting particularly, is a really exciting thing. And I hope that we continue to see more of that as we continue going.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, James, final 2 questions. First, what are 3 podcasts you'd recommend?
I would recommend, firstly, it's an old one. It's a true crime podcast called Death in Ice Valley. I would recommend it because, firstly, it's a co-production of 2 different broadcasters, which I always think is interesting, the BBC and Norway's NRK. It's got some really clever production techniques in it. So it's very clearly a very beautifully produced true crime show. But what it's also built in is it's built in feedback from the audience. So every single week you hear the audience's emails saying, "Oh, have you considered that this might have been the reason why the suitcase was put where the suitcase was put," or whatever it might be. And so they made this show in a very interesting, clever way. And the other reason why I would recommend it is it's just so beautifully made, but they understand the benefit of pauses. They understand the benefit of time for you to think as you're listening to something. So Death in Ice Valley, definitely number 1. The Bugle, number 2, which is these aren't in any particular order. The Bugle, my second choice, would be it's a satirical podcast with comedians looking at the week's news. And I find that really interesting because of the business model, because of the consistency. It's been going for more than 10 years, I believe, more than 15 years maybe. And it's really interesting to have a look at. And the third podcast I would recommend, I only wrote 2 down. But I think probably I would look at This Week in Tech, for example, which is a really interesting example of a video podcast which has been going for 20 years, or nearly 20 years.
It's the first podcast I ever listened to.
Yeah. I mean, the first podcast I ever listened to was one that kind of was a competitor. It was a podcast from CNET called Buzz Out Loud, which used to come out pretty well every week, and was a really great listen. I used to really enjoy it. But yeah, so certainly having a look at this Week in Tech and the way that they make that show work in terms of audio, but also work well in terms of a video show as well. I think that we can all learn an awful lot from that.
And where can people find you online?
They can find me online. The Podnews newsletter, obviously, is podnews.net. You can go there. You can sign up for free. That would be lovely. They can learn more about me on my own website, which is james.crid.land, which I should just check actually works. James.crid.land. If it doesn't work, it will. So that's all good, and they can learn more about me over there. I'm not on X for reasons that you might have already guessed during this particular show, but I am on Mastodon, on the Fediverse, and if you want to follow me there, please do. I'm James at bne.social. That's the airport code for Brisbane, of course. James at bne.social. Is where you can find me on the Fediverse.
Awesome, James. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Oh,
it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for everything that you do as well. It's such a good job that you do. So thank you for doing that, and keep.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much. All right, thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod, and if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.